Well, the first quarter of 2020 ended today, and it was the worst first quarter ever on the Dow. MSNBC host David Gura is with me now to run through the day on Wall Street. And David, for starters, I will apologize for my bookshelves. They don't nearly stand up to the ones you've been showing us over the past couple of weeks. And next to the markets, they were, sorry, my friend, I'm doing the best I can. The markets were up this morning, then they took a turn for the worse this afternoon. What pushed them lower?
Yeah, the Gura home tour continues here. I didn't want to put you to shame, so I've left the library here for another room. Markets were down today just slightly, and it's funny the way that we've recalibrated our expectations for the market. We see the Dow down 410 points, 1.84%. In the past that would be seen as not an insignificant drop down, but what we've seen in these recent weeks is so much volatility, so many dips and so many rises as well. It's just funny, again, how we look at this. But, I think where the biggest uncertainty lies is in certain sectors of the economy right now. Oil prices are still just dramatically low. I think that West Texas Intermediate's now around $20 a barrel here at closing today. That's extraordinary. And we know that that's going to have ripple effects on the economies in Texas, across the Midwest, where there's a lot of oil production. So I think today, and as we go forward here, it's still, investors are still just trying to get a grip on what's happening with the economy here, looking at the implementation of that fiscal stimulus package, that third iteration of it, thinking about what that fourth iteration might look like if we get that as well. But again, less volatility today than we've seen in days past, Allison.
Yeah, David, it's so crazy when you say that, but it's totally true that 400 points, lower on the Dow would typically be a terrible day. And in these times, it's just not that terrible. Something I know a lot of folks were looking at today, March consumer confidence numbers were out earlier. We're expecting a pretty big drop there. What happened?
Yeah, we got a drop. It wasn't a huge drop. I think we're going to see that in the next print, the next read of these numbers. But you see consumers starting to grapple with what economists have been looking at here for the last few weeks. That is how big this is going to be for the economy. So there was a bit of a drop as they looked at current conditions of confidence, as they looked ahead to what kind of confidence consumers will have going forward. That was down somewhat as well. Again, you just see the drop up here as a result of this outbreak, not unexpected in light of what we've been seeing over these most recent weeks. But again, consumers starting to wrestle with the fact that a lot of them are out of work. A lot of them are worried about how long this is going to last. They're worried about how long their kids are going to be out of school. This is just another read giving us a sense of how the consumer is doing. And as you know, Allison, this has been such a huge part of why the economy had been doing well. Consumers were confident. They were outspending. If we hadn't had this outbreak, obviously, suffice to say, this number would probably continue to be strong as we've seen in recent months.
David, Goldman Sachs had an upbeat forecast, I guess if you could call it that, saying there are some dark days ahead, but that will bounce back faster than ever. What are economists over there projecting?
Yeah, so this is a new report by Jan Hatzius, the head economist there. And again, as we're talking about relativism, yes, it's a slightly more positive report than we've seen. Basically, what Goldman Sachs and its research team are saying is we're going to see a pretty terrible first quarter. Second quarter is going to be even worse when it comes to GDP growth. Not going to be much of it. Not going to be any of it, really. Employment as well. But as you say, the bounce back might be stronger. And the reason that they cite is you've got strong monetary policy coming out of the gate here. Jay Powell at the Fed has done so much to increase liquidity in the market globally. He's pledged to do as much as he can do, as much as the Fed can do to make sure that the economy stays as robust as it can throughout all of this as we fight this public health crisis. And then you got the fiscal side as well. That's cheered them as well. Just seeing the size of that package, that larger than $2 trillion package was larger than what they thought we were going to get. And as we saw today from the President of the United States, some indication that there might be another iteration of this going forward, that there might be a fourth round of stimulus that perhaps could deal with infrastructure, perhaps could deal with things on the state-by-state level. So a rosier picture still, but again, it's gradations of rosiness. It's relatives compared to what we've seen.
David, tomorrow's the first of the month, and we've been talking about this for a few days now, but that is a scary date for a lot of people and businesses. They have rent and mortgage payments to make, and most of them have not yet gotten any financial help from the government. If they can't pay, what kind of impact could this have on the economy? Because we are talking about potentially so many people unable to make those kinds of payments.
Yeah, to be determined for sure how big an impact that's going to be. But you're right. I mean, April 1st, so many bills are due. It's mortgage payments, it's rent payments, it's credit card payments. And I think a lot of consumers are going to be sitting down looking at all of their bills, prioritizing, trying to do some triage of their own to figure out what they need to pay and when. And I've read anecdotally a lot of people having those conversations with their landlords, with their banks to say, look, I might not be able to make the payment on time as I usually have. Is there any leeway there? Could I pay a little bit up front, a little bit more later in the month as they wait for those checks to come from the federal government? And again, I want to stress the fact that we did have this huge stimulus package. It is a sizable thing, all of that money going to consumers through these direct payments. You're right, that money hasn't arrived yet, but there have been a lot of people talking about the size of that payment. You know, $1,000, a little bit more than $1,000 might help somebody in one place, might not be as impactful in another place. And, there's no indication that that's going to continue, to roll over. So I think that what we're going to see starting on April 1st is, again, just this new negotiation that consumers are going to have with their landlords, with their lenders, be them their house lenders, their car lenders. Everybody is in a bind here. Everybody's in a pickle. And what we have seen from banks is there is some willingness to maybe let things slide a little bit, give them a little bit more leeway here to negotiate those things. Again, a kind of wide understanding, of course, of just how dramatic this is for consumers across this country, Allison.
Yeah, David, we had a credit expert on yesterday, and he said, as tough as it may be, swallow your pride. You need to ask, because lenders will work with you as best as they can. They understand what's going on. Yeah, you have to call. David Gura, thank you so much. We appreciate your expertise, your wisdom, and your house tour always. Thank you so much.
There you go. Nice to see you, Allison. Thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.